Welcome again, all. Dr. JC here. Week 6. Week 6, a third of the way through this week. Holy crap. Stay alert, stay alive, right? Wow, goes fast. Okay, so this week we're going to talk a little bit about the founding of this new nation. America has gained its independency as of 1783. The Treaty of Paris, the world says, "Hello, United States." And then they say, "What the hell are you exactly?" The French are confused. Do they send one ambassador to the United States or 13? And within America, more specifically, what does freedom mean? So you're free, that's good. Does that mean you're happy? And is freedom free for all? And those that are free, do they have equal access to the ballot box? Are they considered social equals, or will there be a new social deference here? And how might these Articles of Confederation that the several colonies and now states that are operating under, how are they going to work if we're supposed to be a United States? And if they're not working, perhaps calls should be made to revamp them, or as we'll see during this lecture, scrap them altogether. And I'll apologize up front here because it's going to be much more thematic. I'm going to hit you with different aspects rather than sort of a flowing lecture. And I'm going to do that so that we can keep this within about 15 minutes here. Before we get into this founding of this new nation and apply a political lens specifically, what's wrong with these Articles of Confederation? How might this Constitutional Convention work? What's this Constitution all about? And then the ratification of that beast, right? I want to briefly make mention of some of the big questions that Americans faced from a social standpoint. And understand these are questions that we will talk about in weeks ahead too. Now, when we apply this social lens specifically, it's important to remember and understand that just because British colonial Americans are not British anymore, they're just American, it doesn't mean they like one another any better than they did when the British were in charge. The old animosities still exist. Folks from the Eastern Shore have this sense of superiority compared to those from the back country. They worship differently. They're of different ethnic makeup. And how will Americans now address questions, principles, natural rights perhaps, as pronounced in documents such as the Declaration of Independence? How will they apply that to society? Is everybody truly free, equal, and independent? Should everybody have a right to the ballot box to vote? And what about the differences in color as much as gender? Should black and or red peoples have the same degrees of political access, social equality as white men? And what about white women? Where do they fall into the mix? All big questions that we'll talk about in weeks ahead. But I want to spend the next several minutes focusing specifically on the political lens. How did America deal with the problems that were these Articles of Confederation? How united were these United States really? And why did the James Madisons of the world say, you know what, this ain't working, bro. We need to meet in Philadelphia and rethink this whole bad boy. So let's get into that next. Now, as it relates to the Articles of Confederation, they worked for a time. They straddled the world's recognition of the United States and its independency in 1783, as shown on the slide here. The American colonies and then later states operated loosely under these articles for about 6 years. And for all intents and purposes, it was good enough. But by the time we got to 1787, good enough was no longer good enough. From a foreign affairs perspective under the articles, the British and Spanish and other European powers were creating problems for the Americans. An example of that is the Spanish were inhibiting American ingress and egress to the Mississippi River through the Gulf of Mexico, specifically through New Orleans. Domestically, under the Articles of Confederation, it was a little to a lot wonky. Some states were trading in Spanish dollars, others British shillings, so there was no common currency. Different states claimed the same western lands, and frankly, some of them were on the cusp of open warfare between individual states. And then just by the nature of this unicameral single house body that was the Articles of Confederation, I don't think it's too much of a stretch for us to try to compare it to the way the United Nations works today. It's a body that doesn't really have taxing power. It can't enforce provisions because it doesn't have its own army or navy. And in some sense, we could refer to the UN today and the Articles of Confederation the same as more of a paper tiger, meaning we can ask for support, we can ask people to act and behave a certain way, but there's no real way for us to enforce the collection of taxes, to force foreign actors to behave. And thus, from an external standpoint, foreign affairs, and an internal standpoint, domestic affairs, there was too much small u and capital S to adequately promote America's growth internationally from a foreign affairs perspective, or come together, regulate trade, promote happiness in business as equally as possible among all of its citizens, irrespective of state, under these present Articles of Confederation. And therefore, if America was truly going to become all it likely could be, either these articles needed to be updated or an entire new system put together altogether. And it'll be the latter that comes into play when delegates from all states begin to pour into Philadelphia City for this constitutional convention. When delegates began to arrive in May, the 14th to be precise, in Philadelphia City, one of the first things they had to determine was, how are these proceedings going to go about and be held? I mean, is this going to be in some ways open to the public? Are we going to have windows and doors open so that there's like freaking journalists listening to everything we say? Or maybe should we consider making this a closed convention so that we can speak freely without worrying about what some political journalist hack might try to do to my political career, right? Can we have an adult discussion without parsing words? And so it'll quickly be decided that that's the route they're going to go. They're going to close the windows, they're going to close the doors so that people can speak freely. Now, naturally, there's going to be other American citizens, leading voices that find this objectionable. Patrick Henry won when he heard that the delegates to this constitutional convention closed the doors immediately. He famously quipped, "I smell a rat." So while there were certainly voices in opposition to this, secrecy, I think from a pragmatic standpoint, we can look at that today and say, well, you know what, it probably made sense. You want people to be able to freely speak their mind without worrying about having to go ahead and explain that to their constituents when they're running for re-election, right? Part of what we might call the sausage-making process of legislation today. It's not really always pretty, but they're important discussions that are probably best left in secret. So with that order of business taken care of, over the next several months, from May 14th to September 17th, Constitution Day still here in the United States, these folks will create the world anew, to use Tom Paine's words. And after several months of heated discussion, hard work, and endeavor, they will have altered framework of governance in the United States. They will have created a more perfect union. They didn't say it was perfect, just that it was more perfect, meaning that it is unfinished. And so let's jump into this heated discussion and debate to see how they got to this final product. While time certainly limits our ability to get too granular in any way, shape, or form as it relates to all of the various important agenda items that needed to be hashed out here, I would be completely remiss if I failed to mention that all of these individuals, all of these delegates, were imbued with Enlightenment thought. For those of you that maybe aren't familiar with the European Enlightenment, I might ask that you Google that quickly. It was an explosion of thought on any number of matters, whether it be individual natural rights, science, philosophy, statecraft, you name it. And a good many of these delegates were historians, Madison preeminent amongst them. And if I might borrow a phrase from Winston Churchill, Churchill said, I think quite correctly, that history should always be the first line of logic. And thus they will use history, especially Madison, to frame this new form of governance in such a way so that the centralization of power can be held in check as long as possible, because he understood well that once a civilization has attained complete control by one person or one party, the entire experiment's done. The game's up. And so this idea of a system of checks and balances will be brought to bear here, based on historical precedent and based on historical example. As mentioned previously, remember, these states are all very different. Their cultures, their underpinning labor systems. Again, this is the former colonial New England, middle colonies, colonial Chesapeake and South. And even within those regions, there are varying sizes of states, right? Look at the former middle colonies. You have New York, one of the largest and most prosperous, and Delaware, one of the smallest. Not saying that they're not prosperous, but certainly in relation to New York, they're not. And hearkening back to issues of no taxation without representation, representation became an issue here, especially for individuals that were representing smaller states. They were worried about their voices being perhaps diminished by larger states like New York, like Virginia. And therefore, these two different plans were bandied about. These two plans, one, the Virginia Plan, also known as the Large State Plan, proposed by James Madison, called for a bicameral legislature, two houses, so different than the Articles of Confederation in the single house there. And he said that we'll have a lower house that's elected by the people, so it's representative, and we'll have an upper house, and the representatives or delegates that are in that upper house will be chosen from the lower house. So the people will vote for those that go to the lower house. Those within the lower house then, at least theoretically, will choose the best and brightest 2 or 3 or 4, whatever the number might be, to represent the upper house and represent their state in that upper house. And that ultimately there would be 3 branches of government, says Madison here. We will have this Congress with this lower and upper house. We will have a chief executive or president, and then we'll have a judiciary, an independent judiciary. 3 branches, all checking power of one another. William Paterson from New Jersey, voicing the concerns and opposition from smaller states, says, not so fast, my friend. You larger states in this blueprint, Mr. Madison, you'll step all over us smaller states. We can't have that. Rather, I recommend we have a very strong single house system, just like we had in the Articles, and that each state would get 1 vote. That's equal. And essentially what took place in this back and forth was gridlock. They were at a standstill, and they needed somebody to step in and provide a compromise. And that compromise will come from Roger Sherman of Connecticut. It's known as the Great Compromise of 1787, or the Connecticut Compromise. Essentially, this was a bit of an omnibus bill, which means they're packaging together disparate issues all into one measure, and they'll vote this thing up or down. Well, we'll talk much more about points 2 and 3 moving forward, especially this 3/5 compromise. It's a way to bring together the North and the South. Folks in the North tending more towards emancipation now, don't like the system of labor in the South, this slave labor. Folks in the South entirely wed to their form of labor, their property. How do you bring these two together? This 3/5 compromise will do it. We'll talk about that later. But it's important to note here that Sherman's plan basically welded together the Virginia and New Jersey plans. And where Paterson and the small states wanted an essential aspect of equality, they'll get that in the Senate. Every state will have 2 senators. The equality will be in the upper house with a 6-year term. And so Madison will get his lower house plan. Popularly elected individuals will serve in this lower house based on population. And then those that are elected to this lower house will choose 2 from their body to serve in the U.S. Senate. Large states advantage in the lower house, smaller states equality in the upper house. The other contentious issue had to do with rights. We'll talk more about that during the ratification fight. Just because these folks here in Philadelphia approve this, and they will, doesn't mean that they're going to get 9 states on board to accept it as well. From September 17th of 1787 until the end of June in 1788, when New Hampshire will be the 9th state to approve this, there will be a huge fight, much of it having to do with guarantees about individual rights. Those who support the Constitution and ratification of it are known as Federalists. Those who are against it are known as Anti-Federalists. Federalists will ultimately win out because they guarantee a Bill of Rights. It's the biggest concern for Anti-Federalists. They fear oppression. And Madison promises this will be the first order of business when the first Congress convenes. He will get that done. And with passage of the Bill of Rights, America's 4 founding documents have created the world anew.